Okay, welcome everyone. To those of you I saw earlier today, welcome back. For those of you I have not seen today, welcome. As a brief introduction, I'm covering today for Rabbi Saks. Rabbi Saks is in America, hoping to make wonderful things happen for WebYeshiva. The ferret is Rabbi Shlomo Katz's daughter, who is also the granddaughter of Mrs. Selsky. So, when discussing with Rabbi Saks what it is to cover in your shiur, after all, your shiur has quite a interesting and wide gamut of topics to cover. Rabbi Saks, amongst other things, suggested to cover these last 8 PESUKIM of the Torah. Well, I've learned these many times in the past. I never had the opportunity to teach it, and I have to say that preparing this year was quite joyful, and I'm excited to give it over, and I hope we learn it well together. Let's go straight into the actual PESUKIM. I am in Parshat V'zot HaBracha, the final parsha of the Torah, and Sefer Devarim. There's 12 PESUKIM, and the last 8 PESUKIM specifically have caused great debate amongst Torah scholars, academic scholars, and many other people throughout history. So today what I would like to do, and this will continue into next shiur, is one, examine these PESUKIM, see what's going on. 2, see how Torah evolved from Torah She-Baal Peh to modern day halacha and these specific PESUKIM, see how the halacha came out of this PESUKIM, etc., etc. And 3, sort of take a larger approach as to how it was that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave nevuah to his prophets, how it differed from prophet to prophet, and what exactly is the Torah She-Baal Peh, and how did it turn into the Torah She-Baal Peh. So these are all different topics I'd like to cover. I think we shouldn't have a problem doing it in these 2 shiurim when focusing on this PESUKIM. Without further ado, Parshat V'zot HaBracha, Perek Lamed Daled, Pasuk Aleph. Now, I apologize right offhand. These first 12 PESUKIM that I have here are basically good in the sense of how they come out, but there's a few of them that are missing some letters, and that just has to do with how some of the stuff transferred from the computer to WebEx to the system, but overall it won't be a problem. In general, for those of you who have not taken a shiur with me, most of you have, I encourage chat through the chat box. I encourage audio. I believe the more interaction we have, the more we'll learn together. And I have as much to learn from you, obviously, if not more than you have from me. So I look forward to that opportunity. Vayal Moshe me'arvot Moav el har Nevo rosh hapiska asher al pnei yerach v'yarei Hashem et kol haaretz et hagilad ad Dan. This is the final day of Moshe's life. So what happens? Moshe ascends from the plains of Noav to Har Nevo, top of the mountain, to the summit, and Hashem shows him the whole entire land, from Gilad until Dan. I don't want to focus on this in this year because we only have 2 weeks to cover this, but it's worth it to look at a map to see exactly where this is talking about, but that's not within the breadth of our shiur. V'et kol Niftali, v'et Eretz Ephraim, Menashe, v'et kol Eretz Yehuda, ad hayam Acharon, and the land of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Menashe, all the land of Judah, until the Great Sea, until the sea, v'et The Yam Achron is another name for the Yam HaTichon, the Mediterranean Sea, also known as the Last Sea, also known as the West Sea. Vet Negev in the south, Vet Kikar, Bekat Yireach, Yirat Marim, Atzor. See, here's one of the places where Vav is missing. It's Yericho. And in the Negev and in the plains, and because the valley of Yericho, Yirat Marim, the city of palms, and Tu B'Shvat's coming, so I guess it's appropriate that we mention Devarim. Ad Zohar, until Zohar. Okay. Vayomer Hashem Elav. So Hashem says to Moshe, and I have to tell you, whenever I read this specific pasuk on Simchas Torah, it's very emotional for me. It's a very, when you've spent a whole entire year going through the Torah, and when you learn Torah, Baruch Hashem, and you read this pasuk, it's almost heartbreaking. Vayomer Hashem Elav. So Hashem says to Moshe, Zot ha'aretz asher nishbati l'Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. You've waited to see. Your whole life you're dedicated to me. You serious nefesh to Bnei Yisrael. Your whole entire life is about doing stuff for Bnei Yisrael. This is the land I promised Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, saying, L'zarecha et nena, that I will give to your children. Hariticha, take a look at it. Look at it with your eyes. And these are the words, Hariticha beinecha, look at it with your eyes. V'shama lo ta'avor. But over there, you shall not cross into. Of course, I'm not going to get into this. This isn't the first time Moshe Rabino is informed that he's not going to cross into Eretz Yisrael. Of course, the whole entire Sefer Devarim is already aware of this. The whole beginning of Parshas Va'eschanan, Gematria of 515, he prayed 515 tefillos to know whether or not he would be allowed into Eretz Yisrael. He wasn't allowed. Here, the Medrash in this pasuk talks about the idea of he wanted to know maybe he can die in Chutz La'aretz and whether his body can be taken in. Regardless, this is the last psak he gets. And here it comes, and that's why there's a line. The final 8 PESUKIM of the Torah, which, as I told you, is the source of both our shir and lots of controversy. Vayam Hashem Moshe Eved Hashem Be'eretz Moav al Pi Hashem. And Moshe dies over there. Moshe, the servant of Hashem, Eved Hashem, the Eretz Moav, in the land of Moav, al Pi Hashem, by the mouth of Hashem. Vayikbor Oto Bagai Be'eretz Moav, and he was buried in the gorge in Moav, Mul Beit Peor, opposite the land of Peor. That's where they were, and that's where all the sinning took place. I'm going to read from my Chumash, because as I told you, it's missing a few letters here. And no man knows Moshe's burial place until this day. Okay? Moshe ben Mea ve'eshim shana b'moso, and Moshe is 120 years old when he dies. Lo kahata eno, his eyes did not leave him, did not dim. Lo nas lecho, and the moisture of his skin never dried up. Vayivku b'nei Yisrael et Moshe ba'arvot Moav 30 yom. And the children of Israel cried on the banks of Moab for 30 days. Vayitzmu yimei b'chiyeh bel Moshe. And at the end, these days ended, these days of mourning for Moshe. I'm sorry for the noise in the background. Yeshua ben Nun maleh ruach chachma, was full of a ruach, a spirit of chachma, of wisdom, ki samach Moshe yadav alav, because Moshe placed his hands upon him. He did smicha. That's our source of smicha. Vayishma elav b'nei Yisrael, and b'nei Yisrael now heeded, listened, obeyed to the word of Yeshua, of Joshua. Asher tzivah Hashem as Moshe, in the same way that they knew that Hashem had commanded Moshe. Lo kam navi od b'Yisrael k'Moshe, and never after has another prophet in Israel risen like Moshe. Asher yada Hashem panim el panim, who knew HaKadosh Baruch Hu face to face. L'chol ha'otot v'hamoftim for all the miracles, the signs, Asher Shalach Hashem Le'ez Beretz Mitzrayim, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent Klasos Beretz Mitzrayim to do in Eretz Mitzrayim, the Pharaoh, the Chol Avadav, the Pharaoh and all his servants. And this is interesting because this is this week's parsha, and this is how the Torah ends, right? L'chol Artzo, into all his land. And the final pasuk of the Torah, L'chol Hayara Chazaka, L'chol Hamorah Hagadol, and all the strong hand, the strengthened hand, and all the amazingness that took place, Asher Asad Moshe Leinei Kol Yisrael, that Moshe was able to do in the eyes of Bnei Yisrael. So just as a quick idea before we delve into our topic, what was the big deal that these few psukim goes on to tell us about all the great things Moshe did in Eretz Mitzrayim to all his servants? So, like, what's the big deal? Why would the Torah end like as this representative? So the idea is, and it's similar to the idea of what the idea of a Rebbe is and what the idea of a prophet is, which is the best thing a Rebbe can do for you is show you the Chidush of Hashem. Is make you understand at all moments that Hashem is in charge, that Hashem is the one who creates, that Hashem is the one who recreates, right? And I believe it is the Netziv who says in a very beautiful way, the Torah, the last pasuk, when Moshe took the people through the Yam Suf, when they saw the makot of the previous psukim, this in a way was Bereshis bara Elokim. And that's why the Torah ends like this. This is Hashem creates the world. Because it's all Chiddush. It was all that understanding of all Bnei Yisrael, seeing the constant miracles. There was Moshe by his highest level of prophecy, allowed them to see the miracles, as we're told the people who marched through the Yam Suf at a higher level of prophecy than anyone. By this level, this was the way of Moshe ultimately at making them understand Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, Hashem created the world, which if we had that in mind always, we'd be in a good place. Okay. Here we go. Vayamat Sham Moshe. We're going to do two Rashis, and then we're going to look at something else. Vayamat Sham Moshe. And this is going to get us right into the topic. And Moshe died there. First of all, before I get even started, what are we discussing here? What's the big deal? What's the problem with these last 8 psukim? Why are these 8 psukim, the question? Correct? Tehillah correctly points out. Is it possible that Moshe wrote about his own death? How could Moshe write about his death if he was still alive? Right, that's the question. Vayamat Sham Moshe. Efshar Moshe mate uchta vayamat Sham Moshe. Rashi starts right away. Is it possible that Moshe died and he wrote Moshe died over there? Ela ad kan katav Moshe. Rather, until this point, Moshe authored it. Mikan be'elach kasav Yeshua. From here and in, last episode of the Torah, and the beginning of Sefer Yeshua, the following book in the prophets, Yeshua authored. Rabbi Meir says, Efshar Sefer Torah chaser klum? Is it possible that the Sefer Torah we have lacks something? Meaning, these are the 5 books of Moses. Right? Granted, of course, the Torah was authored, was from Hashem, but it was authored by Moshe. So these are the Chamishei Chumshei Moshe, Chamishei Chumshei Torah. How could it be that it's missing? In other words, there's something wrong with this. And not only that, in Parshas Vayelech, it says, take HaSefer HaTorah Hazeh. This Sefer, meaning that he authored the Sefer. It's Sefer Torah in completion. I'll show you what it's talking about. Ela Kadosh Baruch Hu Omer, or Moshe Katev B'Damo. So this is the second famous opinion. No, either Yeshua wrote it, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu said these last psukim, and Moshe didn't write it with his ink, but he wrote it with tears. The Damo. Api Hashem, he died on for Hashem b'neshika, not so important for Ashir, but he died through the kiss of Hashem. Vayikboroto, and this might shed some light. And like, how could Moshe write who buried him? So, HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chodo, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu buried Moshe because of the great covet of Moshe. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, hu kover tatzmo, Moshe Rabino buried himself. Okay? So Rashi gets us started, and now we're going to start looking how this developed into such a big machlokas. Tehillah writes, and that there would not be another prophet at his level. Prophet, he knew what would be with his death. Correct. He knew what would be at his death. But we'll see why that's not so simple in terms of prophecy. Meaning, while Moshe could have prophesied about his death and who would bury, etc., etc., the Torah was supposed to be, as we'll see chronicled, as we'll see noted, a chronicle of what took place. Right? And thus, the Torah is not full of anything of, Moshe doesn't write down, per se, before Kriyas Yamsuf is going to happen. It's all somewhat historical. So that's where there's a little difficulty with it. The pasuk that Rashi notes to over here is from Parshas Vayelech, Perek Lamed Aleph, pasuk Chavav. Moshe Rabino said, "Lakoch haSefer HaTorah Zeh," take this Torah, and the word here is Zeh, meaning the Torah complete. And you should place it in the ark, the famous ark in the Mishkan, and it will be there as a testimony for Hashem Elokeichem. Why is this significant? Because the idea is that Moshe wrote the Torah. Sefer Torah Hazeh. This word is Torah, not Hara. This word is Torah. But take this Torah. Meaning what? The Torah and the 5 books of Moses. So what was Moshe talking about there? I mean, in other words, the question seems to stand, or at least the idea that Rabbi Meir asked the question of how could it be that Moshe Rabino didn't write the Torah? Okay. The Torah is not history. Correct. It's not a history book. And things aren't always in order. But my point was, Mr. Selsky, that the Torah is not written in a prophetic prediction of the future. Rather, as we'll see, you know what? Instead of me explaining it, I'll let other people explain it a lot better than I explain. We'll see later on other people explain it a lot better than I can explain it. I'd like to now move to the Zifri, which is a medrash on Sefer Devarim, also on Sefer Bamidbar. It says as follows, and it's similar to Rashi, but this is where Rashi got it from. Vayamat Sham Moshe. The Moshe died there. Efshar shemet Moshe v'kotev vayamat Sham Moshe. Is it possible that Moshe could die and write? That Moshe could write and die and write. Moshe died there. Ela ad kan katav Moshe ve'elach katav Yeshua. Rather, Moshe wrote until here, and Yeshua wrote the rest from the time Vayamat Moshe on the last day Pesukim. And here we see the major opinions. Rabbi Meir Omer, the Tana Rabbi Meir says, Harehu Omer, Vayechtav Moshe et Torah Zot, Efshar Shnatan Moshe et Torah Kshayach Hasir Afilu Os Echad. There's the question we just saw again. The question is, how could Moshe write an incomplete Torah? The Torah can't even be missing one letter. If the Torah can't be missing even one letter, how could the Torah, in fact, have 8 Pesukim that are not from Moshe? And this is the first question we will answer. How was the Sefer Torah written according to the Medrash in the name of Rabbi Meir? Kodesh Baruch Hu would say something, and Moshe Rabbeinu would write it down. As it says in the prophet Yirmiyahu, right, from my blessed mouth, you will read it to them. So what happened? Kodesh Baruch Hu would read it to Moshe, and Moshe would write it down. Now, we'll see a little bit later, either this year or next year, there was most probably a second step in between Moshe hearing it and writing it down. Okay? Now, another question that's not so much to do, but just if you might have been asking yourself, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Baskol Yotzes Mitzvah Machan. How did everyone know that Moshe died? So Baskol came out from Shemayim into the camp. 12 mil and 12 mil. And it said over there, Moshe has just died. In other words, if no one knew where Moshe was buried, the question is, how did they know, that he was dead? So the question is, the Baskol came out. And where do we know that he was a servant of Hashem? In other words, when he was alive, he wasn't even called a servant of Hashem. It seems like he was downgraded. In other words, when he was alive, he was called Misharet Hashem, the helper of Hashem. So why, when he's dead, is he called the servant of Hashem? So the Medrash tells us, you shouldn't worry. It's actually praise that we find this in prophets. What's the Torah behind this? Why is being called an Eved even greater than being called a Misharei? Why is being called a servant even greater than being called a helper? The idea is that an Eved can even enter into the innermost chamber of the king. He can go in, he can serve him at all points. There's nothing in between. His whole job in life is to serve the king. Okay. How do we distinguish Chaim asks that notification from counting mistake before the golden calf? What does that have to do with this? Full time with Hashem. How do we distinguish that notification from the counting mistake before the golden calf? Oh, you mean like how do we distinguish what notification? It has to do with knowing that Moshe was dead. I don't know what you mean, to be honest, Chaim. Sometimes I know what you mean, sometimes I don't. This time I have no idea. Okay. Let's go on. Chaim, if you want to explain yourself, I'm not sure. I promise I'll explain it now because I don't think it has much to do with this. But I don't know what you're talking about, to be honest. I mean, not that Chas V'Shalom you're wrong, but I just don't know what you're talking about. Okay. But what does that have to do? What does that have to do coming down from our Sinai with what we're talking about? Okay. If someone wants to explain it to me, as always, I'll be happy to listen. Now we go into the Gemara. So there's two Gemaras that talk about these last 8 Pesukim. One is a Gemara in Menachos, which actually takes place in terms of the Seder of the Gemara. It comes after the first one, which is in Bava Basra. Menachos is Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. Basra is Daf Tes Vav Amud Aleph. They're very much similar, and they're also very similar to the Medrash we just saw. They each have a little bit of a difference to it, but they sort of work off each other. And in addition to everything we just spoke, it somewhat shows us and teaches us how halacha sort of evolved from even just this question of who authored the last 8 Pesukim of the Torah. And we'll see how the Gemara worked. Now, maybe I shouldn't have read you Rashi on the Torah, because Rashi, of course, came after the Gemara, and Rashi knew the Gemara cold. So Rashi's job was, hey, you don't have to look at the Gemara, because I'll tell you what the Gemara says in the Torah. So, but Rashi learned it from this sugya in the Gemara. People thought he was dead, but I never heard that a Baskol came out and told him he was dead. I mean, if that's what the Medrash says, I don't know that Medrash. I'm a very ordinary person. If that is a Medrash, I have a feeling of Saks knows it, or Saks knows about Torah. Okay. Let's look at the Gemara in Masechet Menachos. And again, we just saw this. So I'm just going to read it fast. I'm not even going to explain since we already saw a lot of these words. But it's good to see who the Tanaim, who the authors are. Amar of Yeshua bar Abba, Amar of Gidel, Amar Rav, Shemona Pesukim of the Torah, the last 8 Pesukim of the Torah, Yachid Korei Atom Beit HaKnesset. This does not do what we just saw. So Rabbi Yeshua says, in the son of Abba, Rav Gidel says Rav, Shmone Pesukim of the Torah, the last 8 Pesukim of the Torah, and these are the key words. Yachid Korei Atom Beit HaKnesset. In other words, there was a Masorah that was passed down, that a Yachid, and we'll see what the word Yachid is, but on the most simplest explanation, it means a single individual, Yachid, reads them in the Beit HaKnesset. Keman? Who is this like? It's a low Rabbi Shimon. It can't be like Rabbi Shimon, says the Gemara, the Tanya, Vayamacham Moshe Eved Hashem. Right? The Brisa tells us, and we just saw this, that Moshe died over there. Efshar Moshe Chai v'Katav Vayamacham Moshe. So the Gemara asks a question. Remember what the original question is. That a Yachid reads these last 8 Pesukim of the Torah. We haven't defined what a Yachid is other simply than what? As a single individual. So, and when we are talking about a Yachid reads it, it means that we go to shul, like we do today, in the time of the Gemara, and we read from the Torah on Shabbos, or on the simplest Torah. And we read from the Torah, and generally what happens, it's not a Yachid that reads from the Torah. You have 2 people. It's a Baal Koreh, there's someone that stands next to him. I know. Back in the day, there used to be only one person who had read, and everyone knew the Torah by heart, and everyone would be called up and arraigned. But the idea is the Gemara still talks about this idea that you have someone that represents you, and that even, as we know today, though, that even when you're standing up there and getting a lyre, you're supposed to read in the undertone. So the question is, Efshar Moshe Chai B'Kasav Vayam Moshe. The Gemara asked the question we just asked. Is it possible that Moshe was alive, yet it writes Vayam Moshe, but then he wrote Moshe died? How could that be? Ella Ad Kan Kasav Moshe become Ella Kasav Yeshua. Same answer. Nope. Moshe only wrote up here, and further after this last eight pesukim were written by Yeshua ben Nun. Dibri Rabbi Yehuda. That's the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Amrei Le Rabbi Nechamiah. Amr lo Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Nechamiah, Rabbi Shimon said, Efshar Sefer Torah Choser Osa Chad. Is it possible that the Sefer Torah is missing one letter? What do you mean? Moshe had to have written it. We just saw the pasuk. It says, take this Sefer Torah. We just saw this. Ella ad kana kadosh baruch hu omer Moshe kasavi omer. Rather, and this is an extra word, Kadosh Baruch Hu said, Moshe kosev be'omer. Right? And Moshe would write and teach it. Ikam ve'elach HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer, or Moshe kotev b'dama. So now we might understand Rashi a little bit. What did we just say? What's the difference? Until this point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would say the Torah. Moshe would write down the Torah, or first speak the Torah out loud. In other words, Moshe Rabino would hear it from Hashem. Then Moshe Rabino would teach it to Bnei Israel, and afterwards he would write it. What happened in these last eight pesukim? HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer. HaKadosh Baruch Hu still said it to Moshe. Moshe kotev b'dama. We have this strange phraseology again. Moshe, instead of kotev omer, he wrote it and spoke. Moshe wrote it in his tears. He never spoke it. But not only did he never speak it, but he wrote it in his tears. As we know, that we're told that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the pasuk Yamiel, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would say it with his mouth, and Moshe Rabbeinu would hear it from his mouth and write it down. So the question is, what? Again, remember what the original question of the Gemara is. How could it be that a Yachid could read in the Beis Knesset? Right? Again, what's the question is, why is a Yachid reading in the Beis Knesset? Meaning that normally a Yachid doesn't read in the Beis Knesset. Right? That you have two people reading. So why are these eight pesukim different? So the first answer given by the Torah, by the Gemara, is what? Because Yeshua ben Nun wrote these last eight pesukim. So since Yeshua ben Nun wrote these last eight pesukim of the Torah, therefore what? Therefore, a Yachid reads it as opposed to at least two people. The answer is no. Let's say if you say that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it, which we just saw as one of the opinions, then how could you continue to say that what? That a Yachid should read from the Torah? It's the same thing as everything else. So the answer is no. Moshe Rabbeinu might have written it, but he wrote it with tears, as opposed to the normal way he would write it, which is Hashem would orally say something, then Moshe Rabbeinu would write it down and then speak it. So it says, Lo Rabbi Shimon. So the question by the Gemara is, the Lama, the Lo Rabbi Shimon? You know, the question is, Rabbi Shimon, you didn't answer the question. Because if anything, we see that a Yachid reads from the Torah, which means that what? That the halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon, remember, says that Moshe Rabbeinu was the last person, was the person who authored the last eight pesukim of the Torah. And since the Yachid reads, which means that there's a distinction between this part and the rest of the Torah, Rabbi Shimon, you're wrong. Well, how does the Gemara answer this? Just like Rabbi Shimon agrees that these eight pesukim are different than the rest of the Torah, so too a Yachid, which is different than multiple people, reads from the Torah. So again, Rabbi Shimon doesn't argue that these last eight pesukim of the Torah are normal. He agrees that there's something different about these last eight pesukim of the Torah. But what he says is that the question of whether Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it or not, Avadai Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it. He just wrote it in a different way. V'dama, and because he wrote it in a different way, the halacha is that a Yachid reads. And a Yachid reads from the Torah. Again, when we talk about reading from the Torah, it means literally going up and having an aliyah. Okay? Let's see. One second. How do we distinguish? It has to do with knowing that Moshe was dead, with Moshe returning from Zion. Midrash is that Satan showed that Moshe's coffin. Okay? So why was there a need of a bakal inform the people of Moshe's death? They would have known about it already since Moshe had already written about it. Correct? That's another question. In other words, Sherry asked a question. If Moshe in Parshas Vayelech, which was already the last day of his life, to Sefer Torah Azos, how was it possible? You know, they would all know about it. It was already sitting in the Tzad Aron Hashem. It was sitting in the Aron Hashem. So it would make sense, at least according to the way Sherry posed her question, that what? That Moshe Rabino, people knew that he was going to die. Even though you can possibly say that this is all just one speech. In other words, Moshe in the same speech that he says, Kachat Sefer Torah Zeh, gives them the Torah. He then gives them the Torah and goes up to the mountain. So maybe they ran really quickly to them and they say, what happened to Moshe? And Moshe is dead. But the question again is how could Moshe have written about his own death? It just makes no sense. So Chaim writes, Yeshua was already installed and they had a new leader to tell them the news. The Seder, it could be. And in fact, as we'll see, that is more of the mainstream position. The point and the question is, the first question is more of a general question. What's the general question? The general question is, how could it be that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't write the end of the Torah? Because these are the Chamisha Chumshei Moshe. Then the Gemara asks more of a Talmudic-like question, and this is how I'm showing you how the Torah evolves, and what Torah She-Baal Peh is. Okay, there is a halacha. Where does the halacha come from? The halacha comes from the Torah. It was passed down. It came down from where? Mimoshe Mehar Sinai. It came down from Torah Moshe Sinai when he gave the Torah of Sinai, whatever that means. But then what's the halacha that everyone knows? That a yochid, a singular individual, reads these last 8 pesukim from the Torah, as opposed to what? As opposed to multiple people. So how does that tie in? So the way we have to understand how that ties in is who is really the author of the last 8 pesukim from the Torah. So first we say that since it's different, Yeshua has to, it must be that Yeshua wrote it because it's a different part of Torah. But then we write, no, it can't be different because Moshe Rabino had to have written the last thing. And therefore, there's a question on this guy, well, then why is it different? So the answer is because Moshe didn't write it normally. Moshe wrote it with his tears. So we're going to investigate the following things. First, we're going to investigate what it is that the halacha actually says. In other words, does a person... what does it mean to be a yachid, and how does a person, and why is a person, reading it b'yachidus? Then the next thing we're going to look at again is what does it mean that Moshe wrote with Dama, like that he wrote it differently, and why did he write it differently? And again, the question of how could it be that Moshe wrote the end of the Torah? Okay, this is Rashi on the same thing. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer, and again over here, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, I explained this outside, Moshe Omer Acharav, Moshe would repeat the Torah after HaKadosh Baruch Hu would say it, Kedei shelo yitz'ed b'chotev v'chotev. Why would Moshe repeat the Torah out loud after HaKadosh Baruch Hu would say it? So he could say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, did I hear you correctly, HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, write down these words, Eilish Shemos B'nai Yisrael. These are the names of B'nai Yisrael. So Moshe would repeat Eilish Shemos B'nai Yisrael before he would write it down. Why is this interesting also? What's interesting is in modern day Safras, people who write Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzahs, there's a chumrah. It's a chumrah. Remember, it's not halacha, but that the sofer, before he writes down the Torah Mezuzah and the Tefillin, says out the word before he writes it down. Again, Kadei Shelo Yiteh B'Chotev V'Chotev, so he doesn't make a mistake. So it's interesting. It's interesting that its sources obviously in the Gemara, as everything else is, which is again, and then that's how our halacha came down. Mikan ve'elach Moshe kasav b'dama. Moshe wrote the last 8 pesukim with his tears. V'lo haya omer acharav mirov tzaro. And why is this different? What does it mean he wrote with his tears? That he didn't write, just like we said up to now, until the last 8 pesukim of the Torah, Moshe would repeat after Hashem. Here he would not repeat after Hashem. Why? Because he had merov tzaro. And this sort of fits into what Chaim was saying, and I don't remember the other person was saying that perhaps it was just, I think the Mrs. Selsky said that it was just prophecy. So this fits into that idea. Moshe was having prophecy, but he started crying. And he started having a lot of pain and anguish. And therefore he didn't even have the strength in his voice to repeat to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's what it means, Rashi tells us, that he wrote it with his tears. Since he couldn't talk about it, so he was crying, and he never repeated it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Chaim says, given the variant spelling sources addressed anywhere, whether it was given word by word or letter by letter in the majority of the Torah. It's just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer. HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke the Torah. It's an interesting question, Chaim, and we'll see. One of the last things we'll cover at the end of the next year is an answer, but it's only gone. So that won't answer that question exactly, but it'll give you some insight on what the letters of the Torah is. Okay. This is the Gemara, very similar Gemara in Maseches Bava Basra, right? Everything is the same. It says it out a little better. I'm just going to read it quickly. Yeshua katav Sifrosh PESUKIM of the Torah. Yeshua wrote both Sefer Yeshua and the 8 PESUKIM of the Torah, says Mar. Tanya, there's a verse that says, K'man damar Shmona PESUKIM of the Torah, Yeshua katvan the Tanya, Vayamasham Moshe Hashem, Efshar Moshe? Is it possible that Moshe really wrote this and not Yeshua? Because of Vayamasham Moshe. So the Gemara answers, no. It says Vayamasham Moshe. So how could if it says Vayamasham Moshe, if Moshe died there, how could Moshe have written? Ela Adkan Kasav Moshe, Mikam Ela Kasav Yeshua. Okay, the same idea. Moshe wrote up there, Yeshua wrote after. Divrei Rabbi Yeshua, this is what Rabbi Yeshua says. Amar le Rechemya, Amar le Rabbi Shimon, and Rechemya, in the name, perhaps Rabbi Shimon said this, Efshar Sefer Torah Chatzar Azuchat? The same question. Is it possible that the Sefer Torah was missing anything from Moshe? La Koachat Sefer Torah Zeh? Moshe specifically says, take this Torah, and that goes back to Shari Levine's question. This must have included what Moshe Rabino had written. Vayamas Moshe. Ella ad kana Kadosh Baruch Hu Omer, or Moshe Omer v'Kosev. This is where Rashi got to these milim, because remember, I told you the Medrash doesn't have this. But Rashi over here gets it from the Gemara over here. That what? That up to this point, Kadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe, and Moshe then repeated it, and then wrote it down. Kadosh Baruch Hu Moshe got up. Until this point, Kadosh Baruch Hu said it, and Moshe wrote it with his tears. Moshe Rabino, Vayomer Lahem Baruch Hu. Okay, so here that Gemara is just a little bit clearer. We see where Rashi gets it. Vani kotev ala sefer b'dayo. Okay, so then the Gemara asks the same question. Shmona PESUKIM shebaTorah yachad karenos. Could it be that the last PESUKIM of the Torah is written then? In other words, if Moshe Rabino really wrote it, why the 8 last PESUKIM of the Torah, a yachid writes them? Lema afilu temer Rabbi Shimon hoil b'shanishan. No. Rabbi Shimon, who's the one who says that Moshe Rabino was the one who wrote the last 8 PESUKIM, says that he wrote them differently, because again, he wrote them in tears. Here we go. This is where it gets a lot of fun. There's a midrash that the last 8 lines given letter by letter without spacing the hun. There is, very good, and we'll see what that means. Excuse me. So this is a very important note that's in Rashi on this Gemara. Who finished the Torah? Maneiske. Tanya Khan Demar Kolach Tani Lel Yeshua Katav Sifrosh. One of PESUKIM Shvatorah Tzehach Tanu Kamei Demar Yeshua Kosman. That what Yeshua wrote down everything. And here it says the Tanya. It's a machlokes. But this is what I want to show you. Achulu Milsa Kai de Kamar Hakadosh Baruch Hu Omer Moshe Kosev Kamish Matzin Shanim Kosem Rambam. That what? At the Naviim, the prophets who obviously came from Yeshua and onwards, learned that what? From Moshe Rabbeinu's interaction with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's dialogue with Moshe, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would say to Moshe and write it down. That's how Torah She-Baal Peh took place. That what? The Navies would hear it from their rabbis and then write it down. They'd repeat it and then they'd write it down. And that's sort of what took place. And that's what the Nevi'im is. Yachid Kores, I'm calling Emav Sikaman. Okay? This is all somewhat of a repeat. And now, let's look at more of a halachic side of this. This is a Rashi that we didn't look at. Yachid Koreosan, that a single person reads it. Adam Echad Korin, one person comes up to the Torah and reads it. We're defining what a Yachid means. The Ein Mafsik Ben Time, Kedei La'amod Acher V'Likrot, and there is no hefsek, there is no break between the PESUKIM. Kedei La'achod Amod V'Likrot. We know the halacha is that you can have an aliyah minimal 3 PESUKIM. Right? Which means that if it's 8 PESUKIM, you can get at least 2 aliyahs out of here. So what does it mean, Yachid Koreo San? And it should be read by one? Meaning that only one person can get this last 8 PESUKIM. Right? And if only one pasuk can get these last 8 PESUKIM, then what? Then that's what Yachid means. But regardless, Rashi agrees that this is separate than the rest of the Torah. Because here only one person can read the last 8 PESUKIM as opposed to 2 people. After Sefer Torah Chaser, Rashi says it's possible that Sefer Torah is missing. Moshe Karolo Sefer Torah Chakolcha Sefer Torah is there. Right, this is the question Shari Levine asked. But here, the one point I wanted to show you here is how Rashi understands Yachid. Let's look at Tosfos. So Tosfos on Menachos says as follows. Shmona Pesukim of Torah Yachid Kareosan. The last 8 Pesukim of the Torah, a Yachid reads them. So in other words, what? It's different than the rest of the Torah where it's not a Yachid that reads this. Rabbi Meshulam, there was a guy named Rabbi Meshulam, Balei Tosfos. Now what does it mean, Yachid? It means that a Shliach Tzibor doesn't read with him. Meaning that a Yachid literally means that it's one person reading. So again, let's just review for those of you who might not know what happens in the Olam of Beis Knesset. You get an Aliyah, you get called up to the Torah. There is a Baal Koreh there. Yes, a person can read it by himself, but there's a Baal Koreh there, and you read it with him. He reads it, and you read it in an undertone. Here it says, Rabbi Meshulam, Balei Tosfos says, what does a Yachid mean? That's not the case. A Yachid means that you have to read it. You must read it yourself. There's a halacha is that you can't have someone else read it for you. Rashi, of course, says the Yachid is what? That these 8 psukim need to be read themselves and not, and you can't have any break within them. Okay? Tila writes, Tila writes, aren't there other psukim that can't be divided? There are other psukim that, sets of psukim that are divided. That has more to do when there's a psik, when there's a break in the actual parshiot of how the Torah is written. But here, specifically, there is no break. And so the way Rabbi Meshulam explains it, and I'm not going to go into the rest of Tosfos, which actually deals with how the history of Kriyas Torah and how people used to read. It's from Tosfos and Megillah, how people used to read from the Torah, and how eventually it turned into that people didn't represent themselves anymore, but there was a Baal Koreh. But I'm not going to get into that. But here the important part is that even though you could have a Shliach Tzibor read with you, no, a Yachid has to read. The Rimagash says, and I wrote this in English, this is how we know to have Chassan Torah, meaning that it should be separate from everything else. What's his idea of Yachid? Yachid means, not like Rashi, who says that you can't divide it up, but that these 8 psukim stand alone. And how do we know this? Because, of course, in Simchas Torah, these 8 psukim, what happens? We read them alone, right? We don't read them with anything else. It's called Chassan Torah. It's the end of the Torah. And that's why they have special status, so to say. I'm going to get back to the Rambam, actually. Now, just to show you, one second. Sorry. Just to show you 2 other opinions. Or Chaim, the Shulchan Aruch says, it's not, didn't come out good, but, the Shulchan Aruch seems to agree with Rashi. But ain't mafsikim by him. We don't have any break. So the Shulchan Aruch, our code of law, says what? That these 8 psukim of the Torah, he holds like Rashi. We can't have any breaks. So that's how the Shulchan Aruch. The Mishnah Brura on a separate note says, he agrees with the Shulchan Aruch. We don't have any breaks. We don't break between. You have to read them 8 psukim together. He agrees. And why does the Mishnah Brura say we don't have a break? Because from the Gemara that says Yachid, but how does the Mishnah Brura understand? That actually Yoshua wrote the Torah, those last 8 psukim. And therefore, he does quote, as Mishnah Brura always does, he was very diplomatic, he does quote the other opinion that Moshe Rabino perhaps authored it, B'dama, but he seems to say that the authoritative position, and of course this is how the Mishnah Brura operated when paskening halacha, he brings a lot of opinions, but he seems by bringing the first opinion that it really was Yehoshua who wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah, and that's why halacha l'maaseh we do something different, which is we don't break in these psukim. Okay? Now let's look at something very interesting. Before we do that, this is something else. How does the Ramah, or Moshe Israel is the famous Ashkenazic posek who comments on the Shulchan Aruch, how does he understand the word Yachid? That a Yachid has to read the last 8 psukim of the Torah. We know that often we have Katanim, we have people under the age of Bar Mitzvah reading the Torah. You know, we do Chassan Torah, and you bring a Katan. Why would you bring a Katan? Because of course a Katan most probably can get an Aliyah if it's not from the Torah, from the Navies. And that's why sometimes a Katan, in theory, could read a Haftarah. But what does the Ramah says? And he says this in the name of the Mordechai, the famous Ashkenazic and Nagos Mayos, the famous Talmidim of the Maharam in Württemberg. What does he say? He says, Yesh Omrim, the Dafka Talmud Chacham Tzarich L'Sayim. What does it mean by Yachid? That Yachid means a special person, a unique person. That what? A unique person has to have the last aliyah of the Torah. Which means what? That something very unique happened in these last 8 Pesukim of the Torah. But again, the idea is, everyone agrees, Kuliyama, there's something strange about these last 8 Pesukim of the Torah. Sure, so maybe Moshe wrote the letters and Yeshua broke them into words. It could be. Could be. It's a good start. Finally, from a halachic standpoint, before we move on to other stuff, I want to show you one more opinion. And this is the Rambam. Of course, the Rambam writes as follows, totally radical. Shmonum psukim shebesofa Torah mutter lekrosotam beveis hakneses befachos me'asara. Crazy statement by the Rambam. That these last 8 psukim of the Torah, you could read in Beis Knesset without a minyan. You can have transit Torah without a minyan with these 8 psukim. Afal pisha kol Torah, even though it's all Torah, Moshe Rabino, and Moshe wrote them from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Wow! What does the Rambam say? The Rambam says Beferish, and he also says this, I know you're learning this with Rabbi Saks, that, and he says in the introduction of the Mishnah Torah, that what? That Moshe Rabino for sure wrote the whole Torah. The Rambam holds with the opinion, like Rabbi Shimon, that Moshe Rabino wrote the whole Torah, including late Pesukim. But what? That because the last 8 Pesukim he wrote in a little bit of a different way, the Rambam says, what does it mean that Yachid can read it? Yachid, according to the Rambam, means Tafka, not a minyan. It's a wild statement. What is the Ravid? The famous Rabbi Abram, who argues often with the Rambam on the spot. Cuts of our Ravid. Lo shalanu davar zemiolam. I never heard such a thing. So how does the Ravid hold? The Ravid holds like Rashi, that we don't break. But he says what the Rambam says, that 8 Pesukim of the Torah, we don't, it has to do that a custom reason. I've never heard of such a thing. Now I'm going to tell you outside something, which I am including in the sources, which is as follows. There is an idea, and I think it's the Shita Mikubetzos, that says that Moshe Rabbeinu was what the Gemara and the Yerushalmi and Megillah talks about as a Sirsur. In other words, by the fact that we just explained how the Nevuah took place, which is Moshe Rabbeinu Kadosh Baruch Hu would explain things, and then Moshe Rabbeinu would repeat it, and then write it down, that is sort of what we reenact in the Beis Knesset. What happens? You have the guy reading from the Torah. You have the next guy, the guy getting called up from the Aliyah, who's sort of saying it with him in another tone, and he's teaching it on some level to the rest of the Beit Knesset. So there is that idea, which if you follow that idea, it sort of makes sense what the Rambam says. Meaning what? That because Moshe Rabbeinu never actually taught this to Bnei Yisrael, but rather he just wrote it up, so therefore we changed the minhag of the Beit Knesset, which is you don't really need to read it to 10 people, because Moshe Rabbeinu didn't read it to all of Bnei Yisrael. So that's the Shita Mikubetzos. I didn't bring it, but it's a very nice idea. Tehillah writes, again, if a eulogy of Moshe, then it makes sense that a special person would read this section. Yeah, I think all the deos make sense. Again, we saw the dea that there's no breaks. We saw the dea that this has to be separate from all the other parts. In other words, that these 8 Pesukim should be its own aliyah. We saw a thing that a katan may be shrir. We saw an aliyah. We saw an idea that a Talmud Chacham should read it. And of course, we see the Rambam's idea that you don't need to read this in a minyan. Okay, so we're done with the halachic side of this. What we're going to start now and finish next year is how was the Torah transmitted? And based on that, how was these last 8 Pesukim transmitted? So for those of you who have been in my Chumash year, I've done this a few times, and we're not going to do the whole thing. I only took a few select pieces. The Ramban, or Moshe ben Nachman, in his Hadamah to the Torah, gives a little bit history of how Torah was transmitted. Again, we just saw from the Rambam, who preceded the Ramban, and you guys saw this with Rabbi Saks, the Rambam believes that all the Torah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu, and that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it down. Let's see how the Ramban thinks about this. Moshe Rabbeinu katav ha-sefer hazeh ma-Torah kula. The whole entire Torah Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, Bipiv shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's how the Ramban opens up this whole entire commentary on Chumash. V'akarov shekatav zeh b'Har Sinai. And now the Ramban goes into a whole conversation when he did this. He wrote it, first point, the Har Sinai, Kisham, Memelo, Allah, Lahar. Hashem said, go up to the mountain, Vayasham, et Nalcha, et Luchot HaEven. And that's where Moshe Rabino received the Ten Commandments on the tablets, not the tablets that Apple yesterday came out with on their new computers. Torah v'ha-mitzvah asher katavti l'oratam ki luchot even yechol luchos. Now what? That the luchos ha'even, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm going to give you these stone tablets, it includes haluchos v'anichla v'kol aseret hadibrot. It includes the aseret hadibrot. It wasn't just stone, it included the aseret hadibrot. V'ha-mitzvah mitzvah mitzvot, a number of mitzvot, kulan asam v'kulan taseh. All the ones that are aseh, the positive ones and the negative ones. Imkain, ha-Torah yichlol ha-sikurim mitzvah bereshis. Not only that, the Torah included all the stories from Sefer Bereshis, right? We have the whole entire Sefer Bereshis, which is the question. Why do we have the Sefer Bereshis if the Torah is supposed to be mitzvahs? So the Rambam right away tells us, why do we have Sefer Bereshis? Because it teaches us about Emunah. But when Moshe Rabino went down from the Har, he then, after he received the commandments, wrote down the whole entire Torah from the beginning of time, so to say, until Bereshis bara Elokim, until the story of the Mishkan, the Gemara Torah, Hatav b'sof shnat arba'im. So the Ramban says that the Torah was written in 3 stages. First, Moshe Rabbeinu got certain mitzvos on Har Sinai, right? And that was the first section of the Torah. And that has a lot of the mitzvahs aseh and mitzvahs lo taseh. Then Moshe Rabbeinu came down from the mountain. They built the Mishkan, and Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the whole entire Bereshis bara Elokim until the end of the Mishkan, the end of Sefer Shmos. And then what happened? At the end of his 40th year in the Midbar, his 120th year, Moshe wrote down the rest of the Torah. This is our pasuk. As he says, take this Torah. Meaning he had finished completing writing the Torah. And these are famous words of the Ramban. The Torah was revealed. These are very famous words. And the way it was revealed, Moshe gave it over. But what about the idea? In other words, that sort of like the Torah, as the Torah was revealed, it became revealed, it became given. In other words, like the Torah sort of lived itself out in the Midbar. What about Torah Chatuma Nitna? Everything that else Moshe Rabbeinu received in his 40th year, when he commanded Bnei Yisrael, write down the Shirah. Meaning what? We know there's a lot of mitzvahs still in Sefer Devarim, which is strange because Sefer Devarim is somewhat of a recap of the Torah. But why was that? Because on some level, Moshe Rabbeinu was writing down the halachot, or a lot of the halachot for Bnei Yisrael in his 40th year of life. And that was this idea of Torah Chatuma Chatuma Nidna. But the other Torah, everything that took place in the Midbar was Torah Magalamagot. As it was being shown to Bnei Yisrael, it was being given to Bnei Yisrael. And he taught Bnei Yisrael, and he placed it in their mouth, and he commanded them to take the Sefer Torah, and to place it in the Aron Bris Hashem Elokeichem. Okay, we're good? Great. Now, call upon him, and nonetheless, okay, this is a different point. I don't want to actually get into it right now, unless you want to get into it, which is the idea of, it might apply. It should have said, before Bereshis bara Elokim et Hashems et Haaretz, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke all these things to Moshe, saying. Whereas if Moshe Rabbeinu was the true author, why didn't he say, why doesn't the Torah start off, Vayidaber Hashem es kol Devarim elu Moshe lemor, right? Ha'inyan likatev stam b'fnei shelo katav Moshe Rabbeinu HaTorah k'medaber be'ed atzmo k'neviim shemaskirim atzman. So the answer is that Moshe Rabbeinu was different. Why didn't he write it? He wrote it more as a third person. The Naviim, if you look in the Sefer Naviim, the Zifri Naviim wrote it first person. Moshe Rabbeinu Cheskel, Vayi Devar Hashem Elai, we always see in Cheskel that Hashem said, and Hashem's word, Hashem's way came to me. Moshe Rabbeinu was different, and as it says in Yirmiyahu, Vayi Devar Hashem Elai more. Moshe Rabbeinu Katav Toldot Kol Hadarot. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote all the happenings of all the generations. And what? And he also wrote about everything that took place and all the children of the world and that took place afterwards. Why does the Torah often say, and God spoke to Moshe, and he said to him, as if two other people were standing there, and he says, and that's why Moshe Rabino doesn't appear in the Torah until Parsha Shemos when he's born. And it seems as though when he's born that someone else is talking about him, but it's really Moshe Rabino talking about himself. The Ramban says, okay, there's a good question to ask. What about Mishnah Torah? What about the second Torah? What about Sefer Devarim, which is called the Mishnah Torah, the second Torah? Where he talks upon himself, as it says in the beginning of Parshas Vayischanan, Hashem, and I did Tachanun, and I'm praying to Hashem. I told you the gematria of the word Vayischanan is 515. Moshe Rabbeinu prayed 515 times in the Eretz Yisrael. So the Ramban answers, Moshe Rabbeinu tells you at the beginning of Sefer Devarim, these are the things that Moshe spoke about, meaning that he already started talking on first person. Okay? And just to finish this Ramban, and then we'll end this year. Whoa, is this frozen? No, it's frozen. 1 second. I'll call Yisrael, and then Moshe why is the Torah written in this way? Ein sarich lomar leidato shel Moshe Rabbeinu k'Moshe ba lanu b'Kabbalah she'ayta k'tuba be'esh chora al gabei esh levana. And this is the Kabbalistic idea. And what is the idea that the Rambam brings? Of course, the Ramban was a Mikubal. That the Torah was written, he doesn't use this lashon, 2,000 years before the existence of the world. And everything that was taking place in the Torah, from Bereshit Bara Elokim, and from Matan Torah, and from the story of the Mishkan, and etc., everything was written, the Torah already existed. It's a Kabbalistic idea. Shahaitak Tuva, as the Kabbalah says, the Eish Chora was written in a black fire, al gabe Eish Levana, on a white fire. He named Moshe Kisupara Matik Misaper Kadmon, Bekotes, and Moshe on some level would just copy this and explain what was earlier. L'chen katav stam, and that's why he wrote stam. In other words, because this was already written before he actually put it down on paper. But you should know, the Ramban says, even though this is the case, that every single word, it doesn't say word, Shekol Torah, every part of the Torah, from the beginning of Bereshis until the last word, Adleine Kol Yisrael, the last words we just saw, Ne'emram and Piv Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, were said from the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, La'aznav Shel Moshe, to the ears of Moshe. Kenyan Shal Mar Lahem, and Piv Yakar Lev Kol Devar Meila. This possible we keep seeing from Ariel, and Piv Kol Eila, Aniel Kol Te, okay, we said there. We have 2 minutes, let me see if I can finish this. Okay. Od Yesh Biyadenu. This is, by the way, different pieces of the Ramban. It's not the whole entire Ramban on Bereshis. I took out the little pieces. We'll get to the end. Od Yesh Biyadenu. You have other things. Kabbalah Shel Emet. Ki Kol HaTorah Kula Shmotav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is mentioned. That what does the Kabbalah tell us? That in reality, the whole entire Torah is really just names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shahatevot mitchalkot lishmot. That if you divide up the letters of the Torah, it divides up into different names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hilu tachshov al derech mashal. And he's like, I'll give you an example. Ki pasuk Bereshis, the first pasuk of the Torah, Bereshis Bara Elokim, yitzchalek letevot acherot. You can divide it into different words. You go in Beroshit Bara Elohim, right? These 3 words, I'll highlight them in a specific color. These 3 words, Beroshit Bara Elohim, is the same thing as Bereshit Bara Elokim. The what? Beroshit Bara Elokim, the Kol HaTorah came Lavet Sirupen V'Gmatran Shel Shemot. Right here, Bereshit Bara Elokim is the same thing as Beroshit Bara Elokim. At the beginning, there was a Kadosh Baruch Hu. It was Hashem the Creator. The Kol HaTorah came. The Ramban says the whole entire Torah is like this. Different names of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Meaning what the Torah we have is just some puzzle or fixed that existed way before this. And that doesn't even include all the mix-ups of their gematria numbers, the numerical values, etc. וכבר כתב רבינו שלמה בבאר Rashi writes in his parish, the Talmud Inyan Hashem Agadol Shivim B'Shayim, about Hashem's famous name of 72 letters, Beis Inyahu B'Shlosh Pesukim, and how you can find it in the 3 Pesukim of the Torah, Vayisa, Vayovo, Vayet. That's a different conversation. Umifnei Zed Torah Shet Abo B'Ot Echad B'Maleo B'Chaser B'Asol. And the Ramban says, he gives us a halacha point, and if you want to know why if a Torah is missing one letter it's puzzle, this is the reason. Because the whole entire Torah is actually just the name of Hashem. And it's just different forms of the names of Hashem. And therefore, if it's missing one letter, it's no good. Even if it's missing one vav, like you have the word vayomer and not vayomer, vayachlu, where you don't need a vav, but you can use one of the little dots. Even if you're missing that dot, even if you're missing the vav and the word still makes sense, it's no good. Because all the Torah represents the names of Hashem. Right? Let me just jump to the end of this Ramban. And he says, what? It's a Torah which was written, as I said, by the Kabbalah on a black fire, on a white fire. You should know that when the Torah was written in this pre-mortal time, on the black fire and the white fire, there was no break in letters. It was just one long strip of letters. And you were able to read it based on Hashem's name. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu said it to Moshe Rabino received it of derech kriyas mitzvos, on a way that we have it today, which is how to read the mitzvos. And he was taught on how to read the names of Hashem into mitzvos. That's how he divided it. And that's his point. So again, the Ramban's point is that the whole entire Torah was given to Moshe. And not only that the whole entire Torah was given to Moshe, but Moshe Rabino as the author of the whole entire Torah, even though he wasn't existed in the beginning, and he has to question himself, why did Moshe Rabino write that Hashem said this to him? Because really, Moshe Rabino was just a receiver. The Torah existed well beforehand. And when Moshe Rabino received the Torah, he received the Torah in a different way than the Torah existed previously on a Kabbalistic level. The Torah used to be written in one long line, which is multiple names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was the same exact letters that we have. But Moshe Rabino received it in a way, and he was able to divide it into the Torah we have of today. And that's the idea. Chaim writes, is the place where Rambam gives an example of different word pattern from the letters which makes up ratios? I don't know. Perhaps, I don't know. Okay. I want to thank you all. Next year, we're just going to finish, this whole story about the last 8 Pesukim of the Torah, and how it could be that Moshe, wrote this down. And specifically, what we're going to look at is the question of what does it mean that Moshe wrote it down with tears? What does that mean? So we're going to take a look at that, because it's a strange statement. We saw one opinion which said that Moshe wrote it down with tears, and thus he couldn't speak it. That was the opinion of Rashi. But what else does it mean that Moshe wrote it down with tears? Does anyone have any questions? Okay. So you're welcome, Ms. Levine. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom from Eretz Yisrael, and I'll continue next week, Bezrat Hashem.